Welcome to Behind the Brand, an exclusive fireside chat series. So, Omari, you are the CEO of Resonant Link Medical, and you have been in big companies, small startups. You've done it all. Like we were talking about before this recording, I think you're one of the few people that sort of go back and forth. I think you enjoy both sides of the coin. But
Yeah.
today, what we'll talk about is the idea of platform marketing. So maybe you can help us understand, Omari, like what is platform marketing?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, Howie. It's great to be here. And I agree, it has been kind of fascinating in my career to be able to be on both sides of the coin in terms of small venture-backed startups and then also larger organizations. And I think platform marketing sort of applies on both sides of the coin. I think it's a concept that's not necessarily new in terms of how you present your technology or your innovation. But I think that the way that it's executed and how it's presented and the intentionality behind it is something that perhaps we don't do the best job at. Sometimes it's a discovery process versus a process that's intentional, or it's organic versus a process that's intentional. So, from my perspective, platform marketing is pretty simple. It's a very key, unique insight that differentiates you in the marketplace that you can build on over time. So versus being a single product that has a single application, it's the notion that I have an approach or I have an insight that I can introduce, maybe initially for a single application, but with time and with refinement, something that can apply across multiple applications. And generally, I think when we think about platforms, we think about, a piece of capital or technology that can be repurposed for multiple uses. A classic platform case would be robotics, and you sort of think about the Da Vinci robot, and that's clearly a platform. But I think the component of platform marketing that I find to be really interesting is one that focuses more on ingredients of a technology, and that can be
Mm,
built on over time. And I think when you're able to really do that in an effective way, it not only allows you to cultivate a better, stronger relationship with your current customers, but allows you to move faster and to drive better adoption with your technologies and keep you relevant for a very, very long period of time.
Something you just said, Omari, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially in MedTech, where I feel like companies are almost pushed into a position where you have to launch something new every few, whatever, 18 months. You know this, like when you're at Abbott, when I was at Medtronic, right? You had to launch something new to keep it fresh. But then with newness, you sort of forget that there is actually something that carries on, and that
Mm.
could be the ingredient, that could be the tech that you build on and build equity over and over, over time, as
Right.
opposed to something new every 18 months. And it's like the
Yeah.
docs try to figure out, okay, what is this thing you're launching? What is this new
Right.
thing?
Right. Yeah, I think when we think about iterative product development, a lot of times it's, oh, this device is a little bit smaller or its charge profile is a little bit better. But in terms of the actual ability to affect benefits in terms of quality of life, mortality, or be able to address more patients, generally those kind of iterative changes don't really make much of a difference. I think with
Yeah.
platforms and building on platforms, the goal should be that you're either driving additional adoption in your target market or you're entering into new markets, leveraging what you've already built. I mean, so for example, if you and I were to think about what was the fastest adopted medical technology of all time, I mean, there are probably some arguments around this, but from my perspective, arguably it would be drug-eluting stents. Yeah.
Stents. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you sort of think about the original bare metal stents that were out there and were well adopted. Now all of a sudden you come with drug-eluting stents on the same exact platform that you develop with bare metal, same sort of delivery mechanism. You've already trained the market, and now you come out with something clearly better for patients, and you take something that goes from 0% share to 80% share of the market in a couple of years. And generally, you just don't see that type of diffusion in medical technology in order to achieve it. I think you have to do it based on a platform that people are already familiar with. And so, I mean, reflecting on that and just looking at other examples, I think it's a key way to be able to drive adoption very, very quickly.
Omar, do you feel like you need to own that platform? So, like, for example, right, drug eluting stents, robotics, those are platforms are almost categories or subcategories on its own.
Yeah.
But when you say platform marketing, do you feel like you have to sort of own something about that, that it's ownable for a specific company?
I think it depends on your strategy. So I think if you are, for example, a first mover and there's platforms that you can build on as a first mover, that's one way to leverage platform marketing. So, for example, within structural heart, one of the big topics right now is this concept of lifetime care. So, patient gets a
Mm,
new heart valve, and later on that valve or valve structure needs to be addressed. And there are devices out there now that are sort of piggybacking on the valves that are being implanted for lifetime care. So that would be a way that you would take platform marketing and leverage what's already out there with something new. So if your intent and your strategy is that I'm going to be a fast follower that basically leverages what's already out there, then I don't think you need to necessarily own that platform of,
mm,
delivering a transcatheter valve. But I think the big ones, the home runs, there is an element of the platform itself that you own. And I think one of the great examples that is out there right now is transcatheter edge-to-edge repair. So MitraClip obviously is the technology that was rolled out and has sort of dominated the space. But what's been interesting with that example is the delivery system itself has been refined to the point where physicians are so familiar with it that when you come out with something in an adjacent space on the tricuspid side with TriClip, for example, using the same clip technology, same exact clip technology, very similar delivery system, you see adoption rates that are very, very rapid. So I think that when you can own a portion of the platform or ingredients around the platform, and you can think through what your strategy is to build out on it over time, it provides long-term sustainable success.
that's awesome. If we peel back the curtain here, Omari, that's how we have you here. Was that part of the strategy up front with MitraClip that you kind of knew there were multiple applications of this? You could go from this valve to that valve. Like, what was the thinking back then?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the MitraClip story is one that's a very, very long story. It's a long story behind it, and still a long future ahead, right? And there are a lot of players that have been part of that story along the way, and I kind of have a
Yeah.
small piece in that story, but it was a really fun one. MitraClip, obviously started as eValve, a startup here in the Bay Area, and initially, I think that when people saw the technology, there was a lot of concern that maybe it didn't really have a place because it wasn't thought to be able to get results like you could get in surgery with direct kind of
Mm,
engagement of the valve. And you were, clipping the leaflets, you weren't doing anything around the annulus. And most of the time surgeons wanted to do both. So I think there was a lot of skepticism around MitraClip. And then when you look at it through the lens of the startup, if you're a founder, entrepreneur launching a company, you just want to find a way to be successful. So the likelihood that you're thinking through that this clip could actually be used on the tricuspid valve and those types of things, and this delivery system can be iterated in these different ways and then maybe used for valve replacement later on, there's probably a very low likelihood that you have that level of insight. What I would argue
mm.
is that if you can come with that level of insight early on and you do have that perspective, it can make for a completely home run, game-changing company that can last the test of time. So I think with MitraClip is more organic than that. And I think there's a lesson in there about listening to your customers and remaining very close to your customers, because it was really the customers, I think, in large part, that first came back and said, look, you guys have this MitraClip system. It's great for the mitral valve. There could be applicability on the right side as well. So listening to customers
Right.
and customers providing feedback and sort of organically, I think Abbott with MitraClip found its way to the tricuspid side. And then as soon as that light bulb moment came off that this was going to be a very powerful intervention for patients who were in right-sided heart failure, then it was kind of putting the pedal to the metal, and you see the adoption success that they've had in the last couple of years with TriClip on the basis of that platform.
Omari, I mean, now you are a CEO of a startup, so you're probably facing these exact realities where you need to be focused on the exact thing that you're selling. So
Right.
so I think help people that are working in startups to think about, or what is the mindset that they need to look at both, the product marketing side, which is you got to make sure your first product to market is going to be successful? Yes. But then from a platform perspective, that's almost like in my mind, when I work with clients, there's always the side of the investors, the strategics, the future potential. Because a lot of times that's what people are buying, right? The investors are
Right.
buying the future potential. Current
Right.
market, fantastic. But the
Exactly.
future potential, that's where you get the
Yeah.
multiples. That's where you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
the big bucks. But I think mindset is super important because you, like a lot of others, are facing pressures every day to sell the thing in front of you.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's exactly right, and that's the tension of the conversation. And I've worked on a lot of pitches, I've seen a lot of pitches, and I think the tendency in those pitches is to go to one side or the other. It's very, very unlikely and unusual to see a pitch that has that Goldilocks moment. And what I mean by
Oh,
that is either you see a pitch that says, I've got this brilliant platform, it can do everything in the world, treat every single patient with every condition, and we can do it, tomorrow. And investors are sort of rolling their eyes and it's saying, do you know the amount of investment it would take to be able to get to that level? Just show me you can focus and have success in an unmet need today. And then later on, we can figure out where else this can go.
where
So
it can go.
yeah. So for example, I had a conversation with an entrepreneur not too long ago who has basically developed the ability to come up with artificial tissue. The
Mm.
applications of that are endless. And she, recognizes that. I could recognize that. But my advice was like, let's pick a specific target where there's an unmet need, where the properties of that tissue could be very successful. And let's find that product market fit first, prove it out, and then you earn the right sort of to go to other categories. That being said, you already want to kind of know where you want to go from that point on once you've proven success within a focused way. So you either see pitches that sort of overdose on the platform marketing and it's kind of like we just need to prove that this thing works in something, or you have this sort of very narrow, I'm just going to build another widget that someone else has built 10 times before in a big market that's oversaturated. I think that Goldilocks moment of saying, I've got a key insight, that's sort of a breakthrough that can be applied broadly, but we're going to focus here first because there's a huge unmet need here. We're going to prove it out. And then from there, we'll be off to the races in other segments is sort of that Goldilocks platform marketing pitch that I think can really hit.
Yeah, no, it just reminds me so much of so many parallels, like when Bezos was starting Amazon, right? I mean, it's brought back of his mind probably like this is going to
Yeah.
dominate in terms of an e-marketplace, but let's focus on one lane, books.
Right. Yeah.
Make it work there, so many examples
Yeah.
of like you got to own the
Own something.
lane
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. I think Netflix is a perfect example. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it because it's in my backyard. I mean, the idea there was never we're just going to ship DVDs to your house, over and over. But the logic being you start there, you learn about your customer, kind of going back to let the
Mm,
customer teach you. Now all of a sudden Netflix knows more about me than my wife does in terms
yeah.
of the engagement. And so when you have that type of platform and you develop that sort of engagement with your customer target, your ability to test and roll new things out and ultimately not be unseated by the competition is what's so powerful behind the concept of building on a platform.
Omari, when you think about like product marketers, like why do you feel like it's so easy to fall back on just selling features, product like that thing, right? The
Yeah.
widget, as
Yeah.
opposed to thinking this like broader sort of platform story. What's happening there, you think?
Yeah. No, I mean, so first of all, as a product marketer in med tech, it's a hard job. It's a very hard job. I mean, I don't know other industries where you have so many different important stakeholders that you have to address, and it's becoming more complex. So,
Mm,
generally speaking, let's just talk about the field of implantables. You have sort of the implanting physician. Sometimes you have a referring physician. You have the patient who's the ultimate user. You have the administration that's probably signing off on the checks based off of economics and those types of things. So the number of stakeholders that a product marketer has to take into consideration are vast. So that's point
mm.
number one. Point number two is that you're dealing with a highly, highly regulated environment. And I think for some marketers, that can be a bit of a turnoff because they feel like they don't have the freedom to navigate and to communicate in a way that they would have in other industries. I like to think of it as more of a challenge. I have a perspective and a point I want to get across, and I know that I have to do it within an envelope, and I'm going to figure out the best and most powerful way to do it. But you take those two items into consideration, the number of stakeholders that you have to speak to as a marketer, and then number two, the fact that you have to do it within an envelope, and it can make things very challenging as a product marketer. And now on top of that, you want me to speak to a platform and where this thing is going, and it can become a little bit much, especially when the ins and outs of the days are you winning today, and can you make sure that we win a little bit tomorrow, not 10 years from now?
Yeah.
So I think it makes the tactics make the strategy difficult for marketers to really keep focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is real. There was someone else I was talking to too. She was saying now product marketers are also asked to do like financial projections, inventory, phase in,
Yeah.
phase out plans. Like
Yeah.
you're almost the business owner of the product. So you almost can't even market because you have so many things on your plate. I
Yeah.
don't know what you see here, but it seems like a lot. I mean, there's a lot on your shoulders.
It is, and I think that's why it's a calling. And for me, it's why, I enjoyed those roles so much because in a way you're serving as a mini GM. And if at the same
Mm,
time you can keep a close eye on how do I build on what I've already rolled out and launched before and have a cadence that's meaningful and not minor, then I think that's extraordinarily powerful. And I also think it's something that makes marketing more fun when you sort of look
yeah.
at what have I already rolled out, what can I build on it? It's a very exciting concept, and I think more and more medtech companies are moving in that direction, and they're seeing huge swing factors as a result.
Omari, we talked about the investor story, the pitches. You talk about stakeholders. How should a marketer talk to stakeholders about platform versus product? Like, how should they do that? When should they do that? Who
Yeah,
are the stakeholders that actually care? What's your
right.
perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes platform marketing a little bit more challenging because you could have a platform that cuts across even physician
Mm,
disciplines, and that can make things more difficult. So, for example, there's a company out there called Pulse Biosciences. This whole pulse field ablation concept, energy delivery that's not thermal, so you're not worrying about temperature as
hmm.
much as when the energy passes in the body, has become a bit of a platform, and Pulse Biosciences has a kind of a unique approach. They call it nanosecond pulse field ablation. And their technology can both treat thyroid disease, benign thyroid nodules, which is an issue, as well as cardiac ablation, serving
Wow.
two completely different fields. So, how do
Right.
you approach that challenge? I think from a product marketing perspective, that's very challenging when you think about the fact that the stakeholders are completely disaggregated from each other. And so I think in those instances, as a product marketer, what you need to really map out is, okay, is the platform staying within a certain stakeholder group? And if it is, then it's a lot easier, I think, to target it. When it's across multiple stakeholder groups, then you have a lot more considerations to make. And in some cases, you might not have the capital to speak to all stakeholders. So ideally, your stakeholders stay similar with platform marketing, but sometimes the technology is so powerful, so unique that it goes across stakeholders. So Galvanize, which also has kind of a PFA platform, ran into something similar. What ultimately they decided to do is to carve out their cardiac piece, which actually ended up going back
Mm,
to cardio focus. And they're using their platform across a range of pulmonology conditions. So they're targeting COPD, bronchitis, and lung cancer. And so they're building their platform in that vertical so it stays within the stakeholder.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely harder to leverage any kind of synergy when they're so different, and when the verticals are so different, right? Because you go up to a level where it's so high, you can't really leverage it anymore unless you're touching across multiple points, like how Abbott will come into a hospital account and be like, all right, look at our platforms, look at this entire area of what we can do, as opposed to a startup that doesn't have that many touch points.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. So, what about evidence? So obviously, regulated industry, evidence is really important. I think for product, evidence is great, easy. What about evidence for platforms? How do you distinguish that? What kind of stories do you tell around that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And in some ways, I think evidence around platforms is easier So if you
Huh.
think about clinical evidence, a lot of times it has to be run in a randomized clinical trial. Maybe it has to be blinded. There's a lot of people who are starting to talk about sham controls. The follow-up is multiple years. Getting patients to enroll in these studies is very difficult. So you think about some of these trials and studies to get the evidence to really say that this is better than the standard of care, generally can be 5 to 10 years before you actually get to the evidence that makes it that much of a differential or to really say that you're better. On the platform side, it's a little bit easier because a lot of times it's an engineering exercise is what proves the science, not necessarily having to show something
Hmm.
clinically. So, for example, with the platform that we're working on, we can very easily kind of boast or brag about the efficiency of our energy transfer, for example, or our ability to keep temperature to a low amount, or our ability to be able to support devices that are implanted with depth, simply because those sort of commentary or that evidence doesn't necessarily need to all be derived from longitudinal clinical studies that take a long time. So I think there's a lot to be said about features within platforms and being able to evolve those more quickly and then openly have conversations about the potential benefits of that evolvement
Yeah.
because you can do it on the bench versus in human.
Right. No, that's smart. I think it goes back to like if you could almost think about it beforehand, you can start capturing that evidence before your product actually gets to the clinical side and start building the story for the platform to bolster, right, the
Exactly.
entire sort of startup story or a product story. No, that makes sense. It reminds
Yeah,
me of
you get to like you get to basically start talking about the story before you talk about the story.
right,
And
right.
in an ideal world, you're able to start talking about the story in terms of how the features operate and the potential benefits therein, and then it proves out clinically. And when you marry the two, that's when you have kind of the game-changing effect.
Ooh, that's smart. Yeah, it gives you an ability to talk about the technology before the product is even there, like ready to
Right.
go.
Yeah.
Oh, that's huge because as marketers, you're always, as especially in medtech, right? Or in the medical realm, you're always thinking about what can I say, what can't I say, right? It's not approved
Right.
yet. Has there ever been? Oh, well, okay, this is a good one. So, because we're in regulated industry, we work with, our policy, our regulation, regulatory folks. Love them, by the way.
Yeah.
Has there been times where you had to convince them like, hey, we can actually say this versus that? Like, how should a marketer work with a regulatory person to sort of balance risks, start talking about some of these things publicly?
Yeah, no, I think it's almost a daily conversation in medical device marketing. And actually, you want it to be almost a daily conversation because there's so many
Yeah.
different points of views. And the answer isn't singular. There's not always just a book that you can point to say, yes, you can say that, or yes, you cannot. There's certainly principles, but I think that there are ways that you can manage to say what you want to say but get at it in a different way and different manner. And the only way you can
Mm,
do that is by really sitting down with the regulators. And there's actually, it goes beyond just kind of talking to regulatory. There's also a lot of times a voice that legal has in the perspective.
right.
Because what legal is going to do is they're going to say, well, we're going to balance the benefit risk of this statement. So every time you make a bold claim or a bold statement, there is some risk around it that someone in your space is going to call you on it. And so there's always a question or conversation around the amount of risk you want to put behind making a statement. So I think the stakeholders are often regulatory and legal. And I think from a marketing perspective, what we want to be able to do is we want to tell a good story. We want to be storytellers. And I don't mean that from the standpoint of we want to say things that are false. We just want to be able to talk about things that we truly believe in a way that is relevant to the market. And the question is, do you have enough evidence to say that or not? And
Mm,
that is can be sometimes a little bit of a tricky subject. If you have, head-to-head randomized data that's kind of gone through FDA, there are probably some claims that can be derived that are sort of unassailable. But most of the time, you don't have that level of evidence. You might have, multi-center studies that suggest something. And so you have to be able to find a way that present it that's credible and reliable, but also gets across the perspective you need to share.
Omar, I mean, part of your experience was also in sales. So, one of the key parts of being a good marketer is to work with sales.
Yeah.
So, when we think about platform marketing, how would you train a salesperson to talk about platform stories versus product stories? How different is that?
Yeah, I think it's different because there's with a platform story, a lot of times you're talking about the future and what's
Mm.
potentially coming in the future. And a lot of times with the physicians who are very busy with procedures and other ancillary requirements, one of the big questions they have is why should I commit to learning this new procedure? Why should I commit to this
Right.
field? Especially when it can be a pretty challenging procedure. MitraClip's a good example where of the structural procedures, MitraClip is essentially generally thought to be one of the more difficult and challenging ones to learn. But if you think of it as a platform, if you think about it from the standpoint that as part of this, you're going to learn to perform a transeptal puncture, for example. If you think as part of this, you're going to learn how to navigate to the valve. Those are skills that you're going to be able to apply elsewhere. If you think about the fact that you're going to learn how to use ice more crisply and other diagnostic tools more crisply, those are skills that can be applied elsewhere. And so I think part of the effort from the marketer to the sales standpoint is to get sales to be able to show part of the future to the clinician or to the physician to say that by learning and developing and evolving this skill set today, there's going to be a lot more you're going to be able to do tomorrow. And I think that's a really powerful, powerful message, especially if you know from a marketing perspective what else is coming down the line. You know, Doc, you want to invest in the skills with MitraClip today because it's going to be applied to TriClip and potentially to implantable valves tomorrow. And I think that can be a powerful reinforcing messaging around why is it worth taking the time to learn this.
So back to sales, right?
Yeah.
Because sales folks typically, correct me if I'm wrong, very focused on today. So it's very interesting that, if a marketer is saying, hey, let's talk about tomorrow, because they're like, I'm worried about my numbers this quarter. Why am I talking to my doc about, the future, where this is going? What has been your experience with that? Like, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about the pillars, the real pillars of marketing, right? The three pillars of marketing, in my perspective, are awareness, education, and promotion. And I think those three pillars work in concert. And so if I'm working to kind of drive buy-in from my physician, and maybe it's buy-in for that physician to allow other physicians within the practice to learn a skill,
Mm.
they're going to want to know, why is it worth my time to invest today? Right? So you got to drive that buy-in. And it's not enough for you just to say, I'm the promotional sales rep and I got the shiny new product. You also have to sit there and spend some time on education and awareness. And if you spend time on awareness, for example, how big is the patient population that could benefit from this therapy? I'm going to spend the time, Howie, to train you on this technology. And oh, by the way, it has transferable skills that are going to benefit you for the rest of your career. Now I've earned the right to be promotional. And oh, by the way, now you've got buy-in for why it's important for you to act today. So I think there's always an element of that that's really important. At least in my experience, the best sales team members are able to apply what's coming tomorrow to what you need to do today.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I was a clinical engineer for a bit, and one of the biggest, or most fun thing for my reps to do was to take me along to go see their doc,
Right. Right.
right? Because you spend more time with a doctor, and you start talking about things that's not sales
Right.
specific.
Yeah.
We're talking about science, we're talking about clinical, we're talking about technology.
Yeah.
So it almost helps for the salespeople to talk about something else rather than, hey, I'm gonna, let's implant this, let's do this
Right.
case, because
Right.
it's refreshing and it puts the salesperson in a different light, which is
Right.
usually good for the relationship.
Yeah. The sell always comes last.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there a difference then between what a startup would do versus a big company in terms of like platform marketing, with sales and whatnot? Like how do you see that difference?
Yeah, I do think that there's a fairly big difference. So if you sort of think about that Goldilocks, if you're a startup, then I would lean more heavily on, what can my technology or platform do today? And then in the back of my mind, know how I can build on that later on, but probably not as emphasize that as much versus from a multi-product company that's profitable and public, then I probably would take much more consideration on how I can leverage platforms kind of across the board, because I think that's how you generate a lot more leverage within a company. And the faster
Mm,
you key in on the ingredients in your products that can be leveraged as platforms, the faster you bring those to market and the stickier you'll become.
yeah, no, I think that's goes back to, marketing 101, right? If you can position, you can own a space in the mind of the doc where they point back to that one thing in your ingredient. It's just so much more memorable. They'll
Right.
ask for it, they'll see it, they'll recognize it over time. Since I've got you here, Omari, I have to ask about DTC for MitraClip. Because the word, DTC in medtech is far and few between, right? There's not a
Yeah.
lot of companies and products that does it, nor does it warrant people to do that. So maybe sort of, roll back the calendar to when it started, or how do you see it? Why DTC for MitraClip? How can medtech marketers think about direct to consumer?
Yeah, and I think part of it goes back to that disaggregation of stakeholders. And along that chain, a lot of times the patient is sort of the last to have to buy in on a procedure. And if you think about it historically, doctor says, I do. You go and you get a recommendation, you're going to follow the recommendation of the doctor.
Hmm.
And now what's come along is another doctor named Dr. Google or Dr. ChatGPT. And now all of a sudden, all of us are experts in our own conditions. So I think the patient voice in these procedures is becoming louder, and that's a trend that you're not going to see reverse. It's just going to be more and more and more of that. So there certainly is a role of DTC. Again, if you go back to those three pillars, awareness, training, and promotion, you know, that awareness piece is a lot that patients don't have. There are a lot of
Right.
patients with a lot of conditions out there that they don't really realize that there are treatments that could address their ailment. MitraClip is an interesting one because what it's targeting is something that patients don't really have a good feel for. If you
Hmm.
walk into my office and I tell you, Howie, I'm sorry to say, but you've got mitral regurgitation, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be meaningless to you.
Right.
If I tell you how you have heart failure, that might have a little bit more meaning, but it's still not very tangible. So have effective DTC from a medtech marketer, there are a few things that I think make the ideal case. The
Mm,
first one is that awareness already exists with a patient. So you come in and I tell you have a condition, you're very aware of what that condition is and sort of what that means. Number two, there's already some awareness of the potential benefit if I intervene. What does that mean for you? What is that, the with them?
okay. Take
What's in
some
it for
action.
me?
I know there's
Action.
something good for me. Yeah.
So, exactly. So that's the second one, and then the third one that it's pretty clear to you sort of where do you have to go and that you're going to be able to get a benefit. And the fourth one, from the manufacturer perspective, you probably want to be the dominant player in that space. The
Mm.
best way for you to get your DTC campaign canceled is for you to send patients to a competitor. So that fourth element is important. MitraClip is an interesting case study because the awareness within patients is not that high, and it's sort of difficult for them to get their arms around if they have mitral regurgitation or not. So being able to get at that requires multifactorial, requires some education, it requires driving education and awareness in that patient population. Over the long term, it makes a lot of sense, but over the short term, it's hard to get a shorter term hit. A situation that has benefited from DTC a lot in medtech has been with atrial fibrillation. And that's a term that a
Yeah.
lot of patients are aware of. A lot of those patients are aware of it because they're on blood thinners. They don't like taking blood thinners. They don't like what it exposes them to in terms of bleeding risk. So the concept of left atrial appendage occlusion, which is a device that gets them off of blood thinners. They know they have an issue. They've been told that they have AFib. They're aware of it. They've been educated on blood thinners. They know why they don't like it. And now they hear about a one-time intervention that can get them off of blood thinners. That is a fantastic medical device direct to consumer case.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, having the awareness that you know what the problem is, that you want to intervene. That is so key. I mean, if you think about DTC, are there other traps that maybe marketers will fall into, like too early, or other things that marketers should avoid when it comes to that?
Yeah, I think channels is a really hard one to do with DTC because I mean, if you sort of think about how we grew up on traditional DTC, it was off of commercials. So I think the trap is, gee, we should just run a commercial or put up a big billboard or something like that, where the issue is actually really understanding the effect is difficult to do. And the second thing is if I run an ad tomorrow on mainstream television around treatment options for mitral regurgitation, most people are watching that mainstream advertisement probably is not directed to them. So I think the trap is when we hear DTC, we automatically think about commercials or
Mm,
billboards versus other ways that maybe we could be a lot more targeted to really drive engagement and drive that awareness and education component.
yeah, no, that's so true. And I feel like at least today, there's so many different channels and areas in which we consume media
Yeah.
that we're all in different states of mind when we consume all these different pieces. So it really helps to find out exactly where these people are. And I think there's also so much data. You talk about Netflix having data. There's so much data in terms of like where people are hanging out, right? What are they looking for? Who might be a big great risk of the disease that you're trying to treat. So be mindful of that is I think absolutely important. You're right. Um, what about what about in terms of um too early? Are there times in which a technology is too early to market? I mean, you talked about being dominant. You need to be dominant. You need to be the one that's owning that category. Is there ever a time when it's too early to go DTC?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you talk about physicians that are really driving adoption in terms of implanting, again, going back to implantables, a lot of times what they'll tell you is that they have sort of a love-hate relationship with DTC. So I think it sort of drives them insane when they get a lot of patients that are not good quality patients in terms of the treatment. In other words, that their need doesn't match the benefit of the treatment.
Mm,
And they're kind of coming in and saying, how I heard about this, I got to have it, I got to have it. I think that puts them in a challenging situation. And so I think in terms of going too early, I think you really want to have clear physician buy-in as a stakeholder in their sort of, I understand this technology. I really understand what patients it works in. We understand how to qualify patients. We know how to evaluate, and we have clear diagnostic markers of who would benefit. Okay, now go ahead and open the floodgates in terms of driving patients in. So I think there is a too early component to it for sure.
yeah. I mean, the other thing that's hard, I feel like, for campaigns like that is measuring that last mile, right? So, like
Yes.
patients coming to the doctor or calling or making an appointment, whatever that might be, clicking off a thing from a site to getting the actual implant. It's just so hard to measure. What are some tricks or things that you guys have done to be able to, let's say, report back to management and say, all right, it's working, it's not working, we should invest more, we should stop. What are some things from behind the scenes here, Omari?
Yeah, no, I think key performance indicators are difficult. I mean, you're talking about a lot of different issues. Privacy is among them. So, I mean, the things that you can show is you can show engagement with the campaign. If you're running a web campaign, for example, you can certainly show engagement. I've been in places where we've been able to have call centers put in place so, people can call in to kind of
That's
evaluate,
great.
find more
Yeah.
about it. You can get clear KPIs around, effectiveness through that. You can do kind of pre-post evaluation by site and by center. So if I saw that Dr. Chan did X before he ran the campaign in his area, now I see that he did Y after he ran the campaign in this area. So you can run some correlation, key performance indicators. So there's a lot that you can do to kind of be smart to kind of close that gap. But yeah, that last mile is can be tricky for a marketer.
Yes, yes. I think, like especially when it comes to medical marketing. I mean, pharma marketers, I feel like sometimes have an easier time because they have like direct copay cards or things that you can use and link back to that ad, right? Where people are actually using it to go get something. So it's hard for us. What one thing I do want to ask you, Amari, you started off on the marketing side, obviously sales, commercial, and then now you're CEO. I feel like a lot of um a lot of marketers probably think about, all right, what's our next thing, right? Do I want to keep going? Do I want to shift over to leading a company such as yourself? Do I want to stay at a CMO level? Like, what are some, I don't know, learnings that you've had over the course of your career that you can impart to marketers that's working in medtech?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, pretty early in my career, one of the things I picked up on was that marketing and sales in a lot of organizations are run in silos.
Hmm.
And you would have sort of two effects. Sales would look at marketing and say, these people have no idea what reality is like. They have no idea what I'm up against from a competition perspective. They don't really know what the customer values. They don't know what they want. They're sending materials that are completely irrelevant. And marketing will look at sales and say, look, these guys just don't get it. They're not bright. They're not strategic. If they would just use what we had, they would be great. I don't understand why we're not crushing it. And that kind of siloed mentality was something that drove me bonkers just because the answer was you both have perspective. It's like the left hand and the right hand. And if you bring them together, it's so much more powerful. So what I wanted to try to craft my career around was how do you bring both of those disciplines together in the most poignant, powerful way possible? And that I found when you could do that, it was like magic. It's
Mm.
there's the memes out there about marketing celebrating when someone takes one of their leads and takes it to success, which I find pretty humorous. But at the end of the day, it's true. Like if you have those two working in concert, it's really powerful, and that's what I wanted to craft my career around. So I would say for those that are in marketing, first product marketing. First, if you're looking to figure out how to be the most powerful product marketer out there, then you want to be the person that you're getting called to come into the field. I mean, sort of similar to how you were being called to come in as a clinical engineer because you had credibility. Marketing can do something very similar, particularly if they have a view towards the future in the pipeline
Hmm.
or they have a view across markets. One of the things that I found that customers, clinicians, physicians like to hear about is what's happening in the market out west, or what's happening in New York, or what's happening.
Oh, interesting.
They love to hear those types of things because it's one of the ways that they build their learning, and they're put in a certain zip code or geography or area that kind of limits their visibility. What marketers a lot of times have visibility to is national or even international trends. Being able to speak about that, speak to those items is very powerful and one of the things that will get you pulled into the field. And when you are seen as that strong ally to sales, to that strong ally as commercial, it'll make you a much more powerful marketer because you're also going to get a lot closer to the end customer. And now all of a sudden, not only are you getting calls from the sales organization, but you're getting calls directly from the physicians and the thought leaders and the key opinion leaders. And now you're really on your way to being a very, very powerful marketer.
Omari, you almost, talking about, I mean, you are about personal brand. Like, how do you build a powerful brand in which people can recognize what you're an expertise in and
Yeah.
they can follow you throughout your whole career? What what,
Yeah.
what are some of your advice about building that reputation, among different stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think somehow kind of picking a lane where you can grow in that lane over time because there's nothing worse than if you go from one role or one company to the next, and all of a sudden all the relationships you built up, all that network you built up is not useful to you or not relevant to you. So you definitely, similar to a platform, want something that generally you can build upon for sure. But I'll say for myself, one of the attractive items with coming in to be able to help lead Resonant Link Medical was the fact that we are building a platform that goes across all active implantables. So this gives the ability for us as a company and me as an individual to speak to device-based therapy at a brand level, at a category level, versus just having a very
Mm.
narrow window of what I can talk about. So I think it's one kind of getting back to the topic at hand, being able to work on a platform. One of the beauties about that, it's going to give you a much broader voice and perspective of what's going on in the marketplace. And we also talked about working at big and small companies. One of the benefits for me for working at smaller startups that are very innovative is when I was with bigger companies and we go out into the field, I could talk about what's coming next because I had just come from there. I just worked at those companies. I was still engaged with those companies. And so physicians would love to just sit down and speak with me because I could talk about all the things that were happening in the device space, across the device space that were relevant to them. And that has continued on now working on a platform because it cuts across all device therapy.
Oh, I love that so much. It's almost like seeing us as a platform,
That's
as a
exactly
person,
right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's very meta. It's very meta, Omar. Well, I mean, because it's so true. Like as you start making those relationships, even you're at a startup. I mean, again, Simon Sinek talks about this, right? Where business is about people. If you don't know people, you don't know business. And when you have those relationships at the big companies and you're at a startup, you probably even have better conversations with strategic companies that want to do partnerships with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. And even today, with what we're building, we're working with, I would say, 50% startups and 50% more established companies. And especially with the startups, having kind of been in their shoes and see what's happening and understanding the landscape allows for a much more productive conversation versus just here's our technology. It's about, no, no, let's talk about your application first. Here's some thoughts I have about your application and where you want to take it. And oh, by the way, this is where our technology platform comes into play and how we can accelerate things, get you to market, get you differentiated. So to be able to have a conversation that is highly relevant to them because you've been in their shoes before is extremely powerful. So being able to not just walk through the door with the technology platform, but as you say, to walk in as an individual platform has a lot of power behind it.
Yeah. Hey, going back to career progression, uh, what advice would you give someone that's trying to be a CEO or want to be? I mean, I'm sure not every marketer should be a CEO, unless they want to do something, or maybe it's at a certain point in the startup's journey that they require, a lot of sort of commercialization power from their CEO. Like, how would you advise a marketer to think about that in terms of career progression?
Yeah, I think that it really comes down to where you see yourself adding a lot of value and how you see yourself adding value. You're always going to have a boss, right? So I think that gets off of the table as one of the motivating factors, so to speak. And I think there's a lot you can do as a marketer that feels a lot like a CEO already. We talked about product marketing and how that means you have to
Mm,
wear a lot of hats, and generally you can be at the center of the conversation in the organization. I remember when I was at Thoratech, it was one of the most favorite roles that I had because I could get called down to the line to take a look at product. I get called up to talk to regulatory, be able to go across and speak to clinical about clinical trial design, sit down with R&D. It was
hmm.
fascinating for me, and I loved it because I felt like a general manager, in that sense at that time. And so it felt like, to a certain extent, kind of like a mini CEO. So I wouldn't discount some of those roles that can validate what you want to do and what you want to accomplish and what you enjoy
Mm,
doing day to day, just to pursue something that has a title that comes along with other challenges. There's some other challenges that you have to sit down and focus on that have nothing to do with running the business day to day. And so I think you have to want that piece of the pie as well. But at the end of the day, I had a boss that would talk about how marketing had the most important strategic role inside of the company. And I think there's a lot of truth to that when you see that they're really kind of sitting at that center of everything that's happening. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for marketers to rise up and be very, very effective CEOs. I think what it comes down to is to be a really effective marketer. Part of knowing your craft is knowing your product and knowing your technology almost as well as anyone else in the organization. So it's not enough just to kind of want to work on great campaigns and great brochure,
hmm.
great positioning statements, but it's really to understand that technology, especially as it applies to the world of MedTech. And so if you're effective in that sense, along with all the other ones, then yes, absolutely, for sure, you have a good career path to step into a CEO position.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's one of the for me at least, the most interesting part about being in medtech marketing is like the technical component, and then you have the strategy and the marketing component where both of them comes together. I would never do well selling potato chips because there's just no technical. At least there's probably some, but not as interesting as it is for
You're
me.
gonna get a lot of texts from that potato chip faction. They're a
I
tough one,
know.
Howie. I'm telling you, there's a lot of technology behind
There is. I'm sure there is. Oh my God. But I think that's what draws me and a lot of people into this world, which is you get to really dive into the technology with like with humans, right? With the medical field, and it's super exciting. What other skills you feel like so when you think about what is brand strategy, measurement, presentation, communication, what are some key skills you feel like a marketer should learn? Because I mean you have an MBA. I got mine as well. It doesn't really teach you a lot of MedTech marketing specific type of skills that you need. Just being transparent is my feeling anyway. What are some skills you think MedTech marketers should really dive into?
Yeah, we talk about communication a lot, and I think it's really, really important because part of what you're trying to do in brand marketing and marketing is come up with an argument and sort of persuade an audience of something. But the
Mm,
biggest part of that, in my opinion, in terms of the art, is the listening component first. To kind and the best marketers that I've ever seen are sort of like the best comedians who on stage someone might throw out a comment and they're on top of it and they can change pace as fast as anybody absolutely can. So the best listeners, I think, are very similar where they can really dial into specifically what they're hearing from an audience or an individual and then sort of on the fly almost tailor their message back. So I think that's part of the value of crafting a skill in listening. The other piece of it is the market's going to tell you what they want. They may not say it, but they're going to tell you what they want. And so being someone who can be in the room and listen to customers and capture insights and then understand, if I hear 20 different opinions, what is the uniting thread that goes through each 20? And so I'm going to take that and then circle back on it with my product, I think is extraordinarily powerful and a clear art. So there's sort of the listening aspects that allow you to be a better communicator. And then there's the listening aspects that allow you to be a better product manager.
that's amazing. Yeah, I feel like 101, listen to your customers. It's your who, focus on your who. Who are the people that you're trying to convince to sell to the influence, right? Like start with them. Always let them lead. Omari, this has been fantastic. I'm going to ask you one last question before I let you go. Again, thank you so much for spreading your wisdom, helping us understand what platform marketing is. If today you're a CEO of a platform, almost like a platform company.
Yes.
What's sort of the pitch for your platform? So if you were to be in an elevator, long elevator ride, not the 5 second ride, maybe a longer ride. How would you talk about your platform today? And maybe after that, you can help us dissect what are the key parts of that people should think about when telling a story about a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about where's MedTech going, and we've been talking a lot about the future and where MedTech's going. Where MedTech is going is having smaller, smarter, longer lasting devices placed inside of us that really don't require replacement. And so a lot of those types of devices have energy needs, and those energy needs oftentimes are contained in the battery, or at least they require direct energy for them to be powered. I'm thinking about brain computer interfaces. I'm thinking about neuromodulation devices. I'm thinking about leadless pacemakers. I'm thinking about left ventricular assist devices. If you think about active implantables, right now, the rate of growth versus non-active, so those that don't require energy, it's twice the rate. So they're growing 2 times as fast
Wow.
as non-active implantables. What we haven't had before, kind of to your point and your perspective about kind of the cycles of technology, as you and I were talking about before we kicked this off, what we haven't had before is a way for power energy to come from outside of the body, inside of the body, to be able to drive these actives, which is why the original design and concepts were these batteries that needed to be replaced. You think about a pacemaker,
Mm.
ICD, you have these devices that can be relatively large that are placed in the body and they get exchanged every several years. Well, if we have a way to pass power energy from outside the body into the body, without causing any issues, and you can do that very effectively and very rapidly, you can make smaller, smarter, longer lasting devices that are placed more focally. And that's the future. And so what we've really developed at Resonant Link Medical is a way, a platform that we call Orion that does all of those things from a wireless power perspective. And so what we're doing is we're partnering with companies in all of those spaces in active med tech, every single sector in active med tech we're working on right now to be able to embed our technology to allow for that to happen so that we can create a future filled with smaller, smarter, more durable devices.
Done. Where can I buy, Omari? No, I feel like, oh man, that has all the components. Yeah, break it down for us. Like, what are the key components here that you walked us through?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe just starting back from the development cycle perspective, what I've always thought has been interesting in medical device is that someone has a key insight and then they say, I'm going to go build a device. And they say, I'm going to build this thing from scratch. And it's fascinating to me because it takes you 10 years, basically. It can take you 10 years and maybe $150 million to come up with a new device design, run it through all the clinical trials and bring it to market, sometimes longer and more money than that to be able to do it. And that's just a lot of time and effort versus being able to leverage some components that are already out there. So one of the key insights with Resonant Link Medical and Orion is building out a platform that you can sort of quote unquote plug into. In other
Mm,
words, a technology that's already out there that takes care of your wireless power needs so you can focus on the other elements of your system to get you to market faster with lower risks. So that's kind of the part of the hypothesis around the technology in Orion itself in terms of what the benefits are. Now, the platform itself is super exciting. You know, my founder, Aaron Stein, came out of Dartmouth and really helped found the company with two others back in 2017. It was really based on the concept of integrating capacitance into the inducting charging components to allow for more distributed current flow. And by doing that, they've come up with coil designs that are hyper efficient that can allow for rapid recharging. And
that's so cool.
that's part of the key principle of the platform that we've been building on. We've been building other elements on top of that.
Omari, I'm definitely looking forward to see how this rocks the marketplace. I'm so glad and so happy for you and the company to have you in their charge, man. It's gonna
Yeah,
be awesome.
yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a good group, and we're looking forward to shaking things up.